765 AD, the Viking army ever to set foot on British soil landed on the beaches of North and East England. This was a huge force that swept across the country in a wave of fire and blood. This bloody invasion started with a murder by snakebite and ended with a Saxon king being disemboweled. This violent clash between Saxons and Vikings took place here on the windswept shores of Northumbria. In the 8th century AD, the Anglo-Saxons ruled Britain. They were God-fearing, cultured, and by the standards of the time, absolutely loaded. England was fertile, peaceful, and rich. But all this peace and quiet was soon to be a distant memory. From across the sea, huge bands of bloodthirsty warriors appeared in the northeast to terrorize the Anglo-Saxons. The Vikings had arrived. The Vikings were seafaring Scandinavian warriors, mostly from Norway and Denmark. Their attacks were swift and brutal. They could land, burn, rape and pillage and be back on the boat before the Anglo-Saxons even knew they'd been there. Hundreds of Anglo-Saxons were massacred by the Vikings. Their blood soaked the beaches along the shore. The first band of Vikings landed here on the island of Lindisfarne in 793 AD. There was a wealthy monastery on the island which the Vikings sacked and burnt. They stole its treasures and slaughtered its monks. This was just the first of many attacks. A wave of Viking raiders was about to descend on England. By the mid-800s, the Vikings weren't just picking off the monasteries, they were coming for the towns and villages. The Anglo-Saxon rulers knew their kingdoms were vulnerable, but could do nothing to protect them from the power of the Norsemen. Of all the Viking attacks, one stands out for its vicious brutality and its awesome and bloody aftermath. Around 840 AD, a Viking pirate called Ragnar Lodbrok landed on the coast of Northumbria. Ragnar originally came from Norway. He was already a legend in his own country because of his daring and brutal raids. He had a reputation for violence and cunning, and he claimed to be descended from Odin, the Norse god of war. He'd been robbing his way around Europe, and when he came to England was on his way back from destroying Paris. The Icelandic sagas tell us that he was big, blonde and very clever. Kind to his friends, but ruthless to his enemies. Ragnar's raid would have long-lasting effects and cause the death of an entire generation. But it started off on a fairly small scale. He arrived on the coast of Northumberland with 2 boats of warriors. That's a force of about 140 men. They were dressed in bearskin, armed to the teeth, and ready to rape, pillage, and turn the countryside red with Saxon blood. Ragnar knew his men would be outnumbered by at least 5 to 1, but he was not deterred. He had never lost before and would not lose now. His men were armed to the teeth and hungry for battle. No one could stand in their way. Right, now the basic kit for the average Viking warrior was as follows. A sword. A dagger. No, actually this isn't called a dagger, it's called a sax. That's where Saxons get their name from. Sax. An axe. Axe, very lovely. A spear. Very important, the long spear. A bow. A bow, and of course with a bow you need some arrows, and finally to protect yourself, a shield. And now I'm ready to go and do battle with the Anglo-Saxon. The Vikings had all the weapons they needed to massacre their opponents. Each of their weapons had a specific role and was used at a certain point during the battle. Russell Scott is a Viking warrior in his spare time and knows about the ways the Vikings destroyed their enemies.
Let's think about you as a warrior going into battle. You see the enemy lined up in a shield wall against you. So what's the first thing do you think you're going to use against them?
I don't know. Clean pair of trousers?
Bow and arrows.
Oh, of course, yes, you're talking about distance, aren't you? Yeah.
Distance, bow and arrows.
Okay.
There's several arrows in here.
Now, what's this then?
That's box standard, do your enemy some mischief arrow.
Right. Good title. And tell us about the bow. That's it's yew normally, isn't it? Bow?
Normally made of yew. A good bow, called a self bow. Your average Viking would have grown up, learning to shoot, into battle.
Are they advancing or are they just staying still at the moment?
Well, if they've got any sense, they'll be throwing arrows at us.
Oh, right. Did they have bows and arrows as well?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm going off this idea. Each quiver contained 24 arrows, which the warriors could fire at the rate of 10 a minute. Travelling at 120 miles an hour, a volley of arrows would decimate the enemy.
The next thing you're going to be tackling your enemy with is, of course,
my trusty spear. Yes, this gives you some distance, doesn't it, from the enemy? So they've got a shield wall, so either you're going over them, I presume, or you're going under them. Is that right? Or you just try and get through the shield?
just trying to get through the shield, or even put the spear into the shield. Because let's face it, if you've got a shield that's got 2 or 3 spears in it, becomes unwieldy and heavy,
true, yeah.
drop it, suddenly you've got a hole in the shield wall, and then your mates
that's right.
take the warrior out.
Oh, good. Do you mind if I have a quick...
No, please do.
Not bad, eh? Every Viking carried a spear called a spear. They were deadly. The shaft was a full 3 meters long and made of ash, tipped with a razor-sharp iron blade. As each weapon was thrown, the Viking line advanced. What next for us? Oh dear.
Remember, if you've got spears, they may have axes. It's unlikely you'd have both, but let's face it, the axe is your terror weapon.
The bearded axe was the largest axe of all. The shaft was almost 2 meters long with a blade of burnished steel. It could slice through a shield and kill the man behind it. Reassuringly long handle to get far away from the enemy as possible while trying to split their skull open.
Designed for bringing down horses.
Oh, right.
As soon as a horse is cut down, your rider's on the floor, and this axe is in his head.
You've got to be a pretty brave man to sort of stand up to a galloping horse with one of these, haven't you?
They were brave, they were fearless, they were Vikings.
Yeah. Right, and if this didn't work, what's next?
Well, you're then resorting to an axe if you have one.
The handle's getting shorter, the enemy getting closer.
Closer and closer.
That's nasty, isn't it? This is hot battle, isn't it? You can feel the heat and the blood and the breath. It must be quite frightening. Next.
Finally, you're down to your sword, the mark of a warrior. Every warrior would have a sword.
Now, these are pretty impressive, aren't they?
You die with a sword in your hand, and therefore you can go to Valhalla, the Viking afterlife.
They're honourable to die with a sword.
Honourable to die with a sword.
You don't want to turn your back and you don't say, I'm just going to get my mates. They say, wait there, you know.
No.
No.
Definitely not.
Well, they're going to show me how to use these then?
Yeah, if you're up for it.
Yeah, okay.
Hooray!
Russell! Okay. Oh, you got your sword drawn already.
Right.
Go on then.
Remember, at the same time you're putting shots in against me, I'm putting in shots against you.
Very good. This is terrifying. You're being very gentle. Oh, sorry, did I get hand there?
No,
Here's me apologising. God, I would never have made a Viking, would I?
Oh, you will, with enough practice.
The sword was the weapon of last defence. A fight with one of these was a fight to the death. Swords were important status symbols, given names like Gold Hilt and Leg Biter. I've called mine Brian, and we're not doing very well. Okay, you win.
Call it a draw.
30 all. Ragnar's army thought they were invincible. They got their confidence not just from the weapons they carried, but from the clothes they wore. Most Viking boats carried at least one set of chainmail called a burnie. These were very flexible because the Vikings did most of their raiding on the run, so they couldn't be too restricted in their movement. But they were extremely expensive, so only the big cheeses got to wear them. As for the rest of the guys, well, they had to wear woolen armour, which wasn't very good as protection and didn't look very good either. And looking good was actually very important to the Vikings. They loved dressing up. They liked showy weapons, flashy jewellery, anything that made them look smarter or richer. Oh, and as for horned helmet, forget it. It's a myth invented by the Victorians. It's just not true. Ragnar himself had a very special outfit. A bearskin suit given to him by his wife. The sagas say it was so tightly woven that no blade could cut through it. It inspired Ragnar's nickname, Hairy Trousers. Now, the Vikings weren't just well-armed and well-dressed, they were cunning too. Ragnar Lodbrok, old Hairy Trousers himself, would study his enemies and find out their weaknesses. For example, he'd find out the dates of the local Christian feast days and planned his attacks for when the Christians would be in church at worship, on their knees before the battle had even started. But by the time Ragnar got here, the Anglo-Saxons had wised up. The king of Northumbria, King Ella, was a big burly man and a canny ruler, controlling one of the biggest kingdoms in England. He knew the Vikings were on their way and had gathered together thousands of soldiers from across his kingdom. When Ragnar landed, the armies met. Arrows darkened the skies and ripped through the ranks of men. Burnished steel split open skulls and severed limbs. The ground was soaked in the hot blood of Ragnar's men. One by one, the invincible Vikings were hacked down by Ella's army. The saga tells us that Ragnar and his men were seriously outnumbered. His hairy armor protected him from swords and arrows, but all his men were killed. And as their corpses piled up around him, he was taken prisoner. For Ragnar, time and luck were running out. Ella thought he'd make an example of this legendary Viking and teach any other raiders not to mess with Northumbria. Simple slaughter was not enough. He dug a 6-foot pit near his castle in Yorkshire and filled it with poisonous adders. He ordered his men to hurl Ragnar into the writhing mass of hissing vipers. Trapped in the dark pit, the snakes lunged at Ragnar, but his hairy suit was impenetrable. No fangs could pierce it. In his fury, King Ella took him out of the snake pit, stripped him naked, and threw him back in. This time, the snakes attacked. Ragnar died a horrible and slow death. His naked flesh was pierced by the adders, and they sank their fangs into him, injecting their lethal venom. As the poison coursed through his veins, he experienced excruciating burning pain, followed by vomiting, paralysis, and finally heart failure. Not exactly a pleasant death. As Ragnar died, he swore his sons would take revenge. "Oh, how the little pigs will grunt when they hear what has happened to their old boar," he said. And his last words were to come true. England would suffer terribly as his sons sought to avenge their father's horrific death. When they heard about his death, Ragnar's sons were furious. Legend has it that the eldest son was so angry that he crushed a handprint into the spear he was holding. The second son was playing chess when he heard, and apparently he clutched the chess piece so tightly that blood flowed from his hand. And the youngest son was cutting his nails. Of course, what else? When he heard, and apparently he drove the scissors through his hand. But then you can't believe everything you read in legends. The wisest son was also the weakest. He was known as Ivar the Boneless. But what he lacked in bone, he made up for in brain. He befriended his father's murderer. He spied on King Ella and used his friendship to work out the best time to launch an attack. Then he got word to his brothers to send an army. The brothers put together the biggest Viking army ever, possibly up to 3,000 men. Now that's an enormous number when you consider that Ragnar's original invasion force was only about 140 men. Now 3,000 men require a hell of a lot of weapons. Across Scandinavia, the forges worked day and night as hundreds of blacksmiths hammered out spearheads, swords, arrows and axe heads. Everyone who could provide arms was called upon to speed up the war effort. What are you up to here, Ulfric?
I'm making a spearhead here, a Viking spearhead.
How long would it take to make a spearhead like that?
Well, I can make 3 of these in one day.
Right. And how long does it take to make a decent sword?
A decent sword takes about a week.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You don't want 2,000 men waiting around for their swords, do you?
No, you don't, because that would take a while.
Is there anything I can do to help you here?
Certainly, you can turn this from a rather ungainly looking lump into a sharp pointed spearhead.
Now how am I going to do that?
Hold it on the edge and squish it. Smack. Hard, hard, hard. That's it, you got it. You got it.
Oh, miss.
That's fine. Okay, now turn it again. You got it. Nip it.
Very, very
That's
satisfying job, this is.
Yes.
While the blacksmiths turned metal into weapons, the warlords of Scandinavia gathered together.
Turn it.
They pledged thousands of warriors and weapons to the brothers' crusade. What metals are you using for this?
I'm using a low carbon steel on this one.
Would that have been exactly what they used?
Well, they used irons and steels. It was very hard for them to get reliable iron and steel, reliable metal that didn't crumble and crack. That was the hard job. This spearhead, for instance, this is a steel one. Now, this edge being steel is hard and would actually cut through armour like this chain.
That is very, very hard. Ooh, that's
Careful.
quite frightening, isn't it?
Yeah.
Surprisingly enough.
You don't want to slice your fingers up. Yeah, this would pierce chainmail and actually slice the links of the mail as it went through.
Did you knit that yourself?
No.
Yeah. Just a few years after their father's terrible death, Ragnar's sons were ready to take their revenge. The full scale of their army and its weapons was an awesome sight. Once summoned and armed, the Viking army had one more obstacle in their way: the North Sea. To get this many men across the sea, the brothers would need at least 50 longships. Ragnar's sons crossed to England in massive warships. Their hulls were 25 metres long, 5 metres wide and stood 2 metres tall. At least 50 men worked constantly at the oars. The ships were also powered by huge sails the size of tennis courts. The longships were superbly constructed. Right, I'm going to tell you everything I know about Viking longships. That won't take long. Now, this is a 23-foot replica of a Viking longship. It's clinker built. That means it's made from planks which overlap, and then they're bolted with iron bolts and sealed with something called oakum. This is unpicked rope, which they mix with tar. It expands, makes a fantastic seal, so they really were watertight. It's made of oak, because oak is very strong and flexible, and they used to use not sawn planks, but split planks, which are made from the entire trunk, so it's very strong, very flexible. Now, it's got a very shallow draft, which means it doesn't stick out much underneath the water, so it doesn't scrape along the bottom, which is very important, because it helps the speed. And it also means they can go right onto the beach and surprise people, or up rivers and creeks, which is one of the Vikings' favourite methods of invasion. And also, they'd be decorated, they'd be painted, and they'd hang their shields over the sides. They had a continuous row of shields, looked very impressive, very frightening. And at either end, they'd have a huge carved head, usually a dragon, a drakar, which these boats are called drakar, dragon boats, you see. And so you just imagine how the Anglo-Saxons must have felt when they're on the beach, they're on the deck chairs, eating their ice cream, and all these huge dragons come out of the sea silently, with men jumping off, waving their shields, covered in chainmail. Fantastic, great way of invading. Whenever I invade, I'm going to use that method, I think. Unfortunately, this isn't quite as big as the raiding ship Ivar would have used. It's only 23 feet long, less than a third as long as a genuine Viking article, and it has no sail. But its owner, Neil Wallace, has built it using Viking methods and specifications, and the ship handles like a miniature longboat.
2, 6, hey!
Okay, we're off.
Okay.
Now, who's stroking?
Him. So this guy here, little boy. I wouldn't worry too much about getting the blade very deep. You just got to tickle the surface.
That's it.
There we go.
Fantastic, what a great feeling.
Right.
So we're off to where now?
Not very far.
Copenhagen.
I don't know if there's an Iceland.
It's incredible just you rowing this tiny boat then. To imagine the Vikings actually rowing all the way across the North Sea.
I know.
It's quite incredible. How many men to each oar do they have then?
The plan is that you have 2 guys per oar,
Right,
one rowing and one resting.
right. One doing the crossword and having a sarnie.
That's it, yeah.
Sleeping,
Yeah,
yeah.
just taking in the sights on the way.
So presumably they could row continuously through the night. And,
That's it, and keep going continuously.
And did they cook on board?
Yes, oh yeah, you've got a cook on board. Everybody would be glad to have a good cook on board.
Come on, are we Vikings or what? It took 3 days for the brothers' vast fleet of longboats to cross the wild North Sea. Ragnar's sons arrived in Britain in September 865 AD. Leading the thousands of Vikings who came ashore was a special band of fearless warriors, the Berserkers. The Berserkers were the Viking SAS, elite warriors capable of amazing feats of strength and bravery. It's thought they couldn't feel fear or pain. But what made them so special? What made the Berserkers berserk? Well, it's possible they drank something which brought on the frenzy, beer maybe, or even some concoction of magic mushrooms. It's also possible they performed some ritual before going into battle, like a haka, which gave them super strength.
Ready, go! 1, 2, 3, go! 1, 2, 3, go! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5!
The legends say the Berserkers were headstrong and huge. They would hurl themselves at the enemy's ranks, screaming and smashing away through the enemy lines, and clearing a path of destruction through the heart of the battle. It was said that they could throw 2 spears at once, catch spears in mid-flight, and bite through shields. For Ivar and his army, they were indispensable, the first brutal wave of attack. Ivar and the brothers take this huge army and destroy everything in their path, till finally they come face to face with King Ella and his army. This time the Vikings' 3,000-strong army had the advantage of numbers. They hacked and slaughtered their way through Ella's soldiers in a savage battle frenzy. They were unstoppable. This time the Saxons were the ones being slaughtered as the brothers extracted their bloody revenge. Headless bodies crashed to the ground. The dismembered corpses lay strewn across the battlefield. King Ella was taken prisoner and at the mercy of the brothers. They had something special in mind for him, something much worse than death by snakebite. Ivar and his brothers devised a death which was extremely gruesome, even by the extremely gruesome standards of the Vikings. They decided to give Ella what is known as the Blood Eagle. Now, if you're feeling squeamish, look away now. The Blood Eagle was a rare and ritualized kind of Viking killing. The brothers strung Ella up and hacked him open down his spine. They wrenched out his organs, the still beating heart, the lungs, the kidneys. The hot bleeding organs and entrails were then splayed out behind him like wings, so he resembled an eagle, as he died an excruciating and bloody death. The broken and disemboweled body of King Ella served as a warning to all Anglo-Saxons. Don't mess with the Vikings. Ragnar's sons were satisfied. Their father had been avenged. But the Viking raids didn't end with the brothers. In the 9th and 10th century, England was under constant threat from these raiders from the north. For 200 years, their warriors poured into England, burning, stealing, and torturing. But of all the raids ever launched, none was as cruel and bloodthirsty as the one which avenged the death of Ragnar Lodbrok.